Scott, with your background as a former Marine Corps intelligence officer, weapons inspector of note, what do you think is happening on the battlefield in Ukraine? Because I was only a boy soldier, you were a real one, but to me, it looks like the skids are under Zelensky's army, and that we might be about to see quite dramatic progress towards ending the war. What do you think?
Well, first, let's start by pointing out that Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after European Russia, and that the Ukrainian army is the only European army capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Russian army. And I need to point this out because I don't want anybody to get the impression that what's going on today on the front lines is an easy war, that Russia's victory, and there will be a Russian victory, is an easy victory. This is a hard-fought war, a hard-fought victory that is predicated on the harsh reality of the algorithms of attritional warfare. Basically, Russia undertook, starting in the fall of 2022, to transition to a mode of warfare which sought to not just destroy hundreds of billions of dollars of Western-provided military equipment, because Russia was no longer fighting just Ukraine. Russia was fighting the collective West. And so Russia had to gear itself to a war of attrition, not against the Ukrainian army as it existed, but the potential of the Ukrainian army over a period of time to receive and absorb significant quantities of very high quality military equipment. This required a strategic approach by the Russians that gave up the concept of big arrows and terrain, and instead embraced the concept of very violent conflict along the line of contact that also is designed to destroy Ukraine's ability to sustain this war of attrition in terms of manpower. What we are right now is at a culminating point in this strategy where the Ukrainian manpower has been exhausted. They're down to recruiting 18 to 23-year-olds, and this is it. There's nothing else they can do. They've done 7 mobilizations, maybe 8. They've rebuilt their military 5 times, and it just can't go on in perpetuity. NATO has run out of equipment to give Ukraine. There's nothing left. They're talking about now contracts that will see fruition years from now, not weeks or months from now, when Ukraine would need this equipment. So Ukraine has run out of equipment and run out of manpower at a time when Russia is outproducing the collective West 4-1 in terms of defense industrial output. The Russians have done a single mobilization in the fall of 2022. Since that time, they've sustained their manpower requirements using standard voluntary-based recruitment contracts. And they have more than enough manpower. They're easy. It's easy for Russia to replace the losses and grow their military. And so we're at the point now where all of the advantages that Russia's been working very hard to accrue are coming to the forefront. We are seeing encirclement of Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, a major strategic logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces. 5,500 soldiers surrounded there. In Kupiansk, further north, 5,000 soldiers surrounded. But a report by Mariet Kharelin, a Russian military correspondent, says that all along the front line, there's similar pockets being developed where a potential of 50,000 Ukrainian troops are at risk of being surrounded by Russians who are succeeding in their advances across the entire length of the line of contact. Ukraine simply cannot replace these casualties. There's no strategic reserve left to draw upon. And as Ukraine loses these forces, and notice Russia isn't giving these forces a chance to retreat. Normally, Russia would open up a cauldron and leave an exit route so the Ukrainian forces could retreat. Here, they're going for the more decisive end game, which means they're going to kill these people or capture these people, but these people will not be re-emerging to be part of the fight. This means that Ukraine is about to suffer a major vacuum of manpower capability with nothing to replace it. And this will lead to cascading manpower issues up and down the line of contact. As you mentioned, George, we could be seeing the end game, the beginning of the total collapse of the front line on the part of Ukraine, who, by the way, have fought very hard. We should not ever once say
Sure.
that the Ukrainians haven't put up a fight, and they will continue to fight hard. I point this out to people when I say the bloodiest month of World War II in Europe for the United States of America wasn't D-Day, June of 1944. It wasn't December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. It was April 1945, the last full month of the war when the German army was defeated. They fought the hardest and they killed more Americans than any other month. And so even though we're coming to the end game, the notion that this is going to be a cakewalk for Russia is historically absurd.
Well, we must pray that these surrounded soldiers surrender rather than be killed, because the death rate in Ukraine in particular, I mean, I think they sometimes try and confuse us with the stats on this. Russia will have lost, of course, a significant number of people, but Ukraine have lost exponentially more. The scenes of the graveyards of Ukraine are harrowing. I mean, this is First World War levels of casualties, isn't it?
For Ukraine, it absolutely is. Again, the algorithm of warfare is unforgiving. And what the Russians have done is to leverage superior firepower, superior command and control, to create an environment of war where every day Ukraine is losing between 2,000 and 3,000 troops. The Russians are losing 150, 200 troops. Look, America lost 200 men a week in Vietnam at its height, and it broke our back. I'm not trying to soft pedal this at all. Russia's paying a horrific cost for this war in blood, in treasure, etc. But the kill ratio is absolutely unsustainable and unforgiving for Ukraine. And Russia has the capacity to absorb these losses and continue the fight. For the Ukrainians, this is a merciless conflict. Their troops are going to the front line. They can't be rotated out. It's a death sentence to be sent to the front line. If you try to retreat, you come under fire from drones, from artillery. And the life expectancy of a new Ukrainian recruit coming off of their 2 weeks of basic training is measured in days. They go to the front line and they die. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to fight. They don't know how to survive. They're entering the world's most lethal environment where one mistake results in a life termination event. This is a very sad state of affairs, and Europe is to blame. Europe and the United States. We're the ones that pushed Ukraine into this fight, and we're the ones who gleefully have said to the last Ukrainian. Well, that's the direction we're heading right now. If this continues, this war will be fought to the last Ukrainian.
Well, as you rightly said, or inferred there, the United States is primarily to blame for pushing Ukraine into this war, but the Europeans are definitely to blame for the fact that it is not yet even at the negotiating table, never mind resolved. Given all that you've just said, and the power of it, and the horror of it, how can these European statesmen still be refusing to make a deal? How can they justify sending more and more Ukrainians into the maw, into the mud, into the graveyard?
One of the more unforgiving aspects of this conflict are the lies being told by the West to itself. In order to justify the actions that Europe has embraced, that the United Kingdom has embraced, of sustaining this conflict, you have to accept at face value the notion that Russia cannot sustain its efforts, that Russia is on its last legs. And only then can you justify asking Ukraine for the last full measure. Give it all, boys, give it all. One last time into the breach. We've got this one. Just hold out. The Russians will collapse. But the Russians aren't going to collapse. It's an absolute lie that's being told to themselves. And the sad thing is the leadership knows it's a lie. I can't for a minute believe that senior European politicians, maybe politicians are capable of fooling themselves, but the military is not. And the military knows the truth, that this is an unwinnable conflict. Notice every time a general leaves their official position and starts speaking out, with the exception of American generals who sell their souls to mainstream media to tell whatever lies they're ordered to spoon feed. But most times when general officers retire, they come out and they say the most amazing things, such as Russia will not lose this war. Russia will win this war. Europe can't beat them. NATO is incapable of doing X, Y, and Z. This is the truth, the harsh truth. Politicians can't say it because politicians would lose their jobs. And we all know, with few exceptions, yourself included, that politicians will sell their soul to get reelected. They'll reinvent themselves. They'll tell whatever lie needs to be told to get reelected. And right now you have a certain political and economic elite in Europe that have invested so much political capital into the notion that Russia can be defeated, that Ukraine can win, and that therefore Europe can win, that they're going to believe any lie told to them, even if they know it's a lie.
Now, Donald Trump famously dodged the Vietnam War four times. He declined to be drafted, and his bone spur problem was such that he couldn't be forced to. And yet, to be fair, he's the only world leader that you get the impression would like the war to end. The rest, liberal Democrats, Christian Democrats, social Democrats, Democrats all, they're gung-ho for the war. I mean, I've heard of cross-dressing, but it's getting absurd.
It is, but I would even say that Donald Trump at this juncture only plays lip service to bringing the war to an end. He sounds good to a point. But at the end of the day, if you want the war to end, then you want the war to end. What Donald Trump is, he wants the war to end on terms favorable to the national security objectives of the United States, which means that he wants the war to end on terms unacceptable to Russia, so that Russia will be subordinated to the United States, so Russia will be defeated by Europe and the United States. And this is unrealistic. So he doesn't want the war to end. He wants to win the war. That's what he wants. He should be more honest about it. Not that he wants the war to end, but that he wants to win the war. If he said that, I'd have a lot more respect for the guy, because if you want this war to end, then you have to acknowledge the root causes of this conflict, and you have to acknowledge that the Russians are justified in saying that this war cannot end if all it does is create the conditions for the war to resume 5 years from now. That when this war ends, it must prevent war from restarting for decades, for generations. We don't want to be doing this over and over and over again. Donald Trump refuses to have that conversation.
And that's why Budapest hasn't happened?
Yep. Again, Donald Trump wants something interesting has happened, George, in the last couple of days. The Russians have been doing their best to give Donald Trump a chance to be the peace president he wants to be. And so they have verbally left the door open for diplomacy. But when you look at the Russians' real actions, they've made no major deviation from this algorithmic war of attrition. They've been staying the course. And with Budapest, basically the Russians had put the United States on notice about what the reality of their terms of conflict termination would be, and that they will not alter these terms. And yet Donald Trump, once again, his administration, primarily Marco Rubio, keep telling the Russians, you have to come to the table with a workable plan, a plan that's acceptable to us. And because Russia refused to do that, Budapest did not occur. In the aftermath of that, you now have the Russian Foreign Ministry saying, we don't see a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in the future until the United States is able to come to the table with a workable peace plan. They flip the script. No longer is the onus on Russia to come up with a plan. Russia's saying, no, we got the trajectory we want, that we're comfortable with. We'll do this forever. If you want this war to end, you have to come to the table with a plan that conforms to our needs, not the other way around. It's a major power shift in terms of who's calling the shots. Donald Trump thought that he was in the driver's seat. He's now in the passenger seat, and Russia's calling the shots.
Now, you were, of course, and still are, extremely proud of the U.S. Marines. I've seen you. I know you well. I know that the Corps means a lot to you. You can't be relishing the possibility of your regiment landing on the beaches of Venezuela, because I know that you know that any such action will be resisted to the nth degree, and it will not be pretty.
One of my mentors, a man who I held in the highest regard, George Murdoch Connell, was a colonel in the United States Marines, and he was a lieutenant and then later a captain in a Marine battalion that was called the Walking Dead, and they earned that title because they suffered the highest casualty rate in all of Vietnam of any Marine Corps unit. Vietnam was a trap. We sent our Marines into Da Nang to secure an airfield from, hostile attack that didn't stop. So we had to keep pushing patrols out further and further and further, becoming more and more engaged with the North Vietnamese, with the Viet Cong. We had to reinforce till we had an entire division inside North Vietnam or in South Vietnam fighting in the northern part of South Vietnam. It was a disaster of a war for the United States Marine Corps. That doesn't mean that George Murdoch Connell wasn't an honorable man. It doesn't mean that the Marines he led in combat weren't honorable men. These were honorable people called upon to do a dishonorable task, invading, killing people in a foreign country that were not posing a direct threat against the United States of America. This is how I feel about the Marines today. I know somewhere out there right now, there's a Marine colonel who is the modern day equivalent of George Murdoch Connell, a man of honor, a man of integrity, whose number one responsibility is to ensure that not only he accomplishes the lawful orders given to him, but he brings as many of his Marines, hopefully all of his Marines, home alive. And he's being prepared. He has to prepare to go execute a mission that he knows in his heart of hearts is going to be another Vietnam. And this is the saddest thing of all, because these Marines will do this job. They will disembark. They will land on Venezuelan soil, and they will close with and engage the Venezuelans, who we have to call enemies, even though they're not our enemies. And Marines will die and Venezuelans will die, and it will be horrible, and it's going to haunt our country for generations, and it's going to haunt the Venezuelans for generations, and it doesn't need to happen. Don't blame the Marines. Blame the people above. Blame the people who issue the orders. This is a war that does not need to be fought. Maduro is ready for peace right now. He has said, if this is about oil, for God's sake, come in, develop the oil. I'll sell it to you at whatever discount you want. I do not want a war. This is not about drugs. James Story, an American diplomat I know very well, was the number 2 man in Caracas before the embassy evacuated to Colombia, and he ran the covert programs to undermine Venezuela during the first Trump administration and into the Biden administration. He has just recently come out and said, this isn't about drugs. There's not this narco stuff going on. This is about oil. This is about resources. Straight up being honest about it. I mean, I don't agree with his desire to overthrow Maduro, but at least he's honest about what it's about. It's about oil. It's not about drugs. And yet we have a commander-in-chief and the military committing war crimes as we speak. I want to remind people, Lindsey Graham got on TV and cackled about Maduro's fate. He said Maduro is indicted in a New York court, in a federal court, of a narco trafficking. Hey, Lindsey, you were a lawyer. You do know that an indictment is not a finding of guilt, that actually Maduro is innocent of all charges until which time he is found guilty at trial, and that has not happened. And just because a New York federal court indicted him through a grand jury, you can indict a ham sandwich in a grand jury. It doesn't mean that your case is rock solid. It means it's political in nature. This is a political indictment designed to create cover to justify an illegal invasion of Venezuela. We all know that it's happening. My country has stopped being the constitutional republic that it aspired to be. We're supposed to be something better than this. And yet we have a president of the United States who openly brags about committing murder, which is a war crime. We have senators that brag about our potential to invade and occupy a nation and murder people without Congress doing its constitutional duty of declaring war. And unfortunately, we have a military that forgot the Nuremberg trial's greatest finding, that obeying an order is not an excuse for committing a crime. And if you're out there killing Venezuelan fishermen or people that we don't know who they are, you're committing a crime. A temptation to replace these resources with European resources already. It's underreported, but the number of Poles fighting this conflict is outrageous. The Russians have said that when they monitor, you see it. There's a book that's out about it's written from the Russian perspective, interviews of soldiers, and they keep saying well, we were fighting the Poles that day. You say, what do you mean the Poles? Well, the radio traffic, everybody was speaking Polish, and I'm not talking about Western Ukrainian slang. I'm talking about Polish. There's entire Polish units there. There are entire units of, under Western leadership of South American mercenaries. More and more, you're seeing the Ukrainian army turning to non-Ukrainian manpower resources to make up for the insufficiency of their own manpower deficit. And at some point in time, there may be a temptation to insert a British unit or a French unit or something of that nature. And then when they die, as they will, I'm just here to tell you, Mario, no Ukrainian unit survives long on the battlefield. Even their elite units, when they get sent in for the counterattack, get rotated out as quick as possible because once the Russians take control of the battlefield, they kill everybody. And so the elite units pull back and they put in the territorials, and the territorials get slaughtered, and the elite units go back and to their whores and their whiskey and their money and their food until the next time they're called in to do this. The Ukrainian army is it's just meat for the ground. There's some brave soldiers. Look, the Russians say they're brave. There's a famous story out of Bakhmut where Wagner surrounded a Ukrainian unit in a bunker and said, "Surrender, brothers. You fought bravely. We're not going to kill you. We'll treat you well." And the Ukrainians shouted back, "Russians don't surrender." And that's a famous line from the Second World War, where the Germans had surrounded a Russian soldier and told him to surrender. He said, "Russians don't surrender," and they didn't. It means that the Ukrainians and the Russians are the same damn people. They're the same people. As hard as the Russians fight, the Ukrainians fight. There's no doubt about that. The Russians respect their Ukrainian opponents. They understand the tenacity. But the Russians have built an algorithm of conflict which is to the detriment of the Ukraine. The Ukrainians have bought into a Western style of war that doesn't care about them. If we did care about them, why would we let them do the 2023 summer counteroffensive, which was designed in Grafenwehr by a bunch of NATO idiots, where we just let the Ukrainians go in and get slaughtered in frontal attacks against a prepared Russian defense? Why did we encourage them to go into Kursk and sacrifice 76,000 Ukrainian soldiers for a political gesture that got them nothing but dead soldiers? We don't care about them, and we've organized them to fight a war that they can't win, and it's a tragedy.
There's a last question. I'll take it from the comments here, and it's discussing the advancements. Do you think Russia's advances were stronger when Prigozhin and Wagner were around?
No, there were Prigozhin and Wagner had a unique role in this war. They, let's just get down to technicalities. Russia legally was not allowed to provide military support to deploy Russian soldiers on the soil of either Donetsk and Lugansk. They were, first of all, they're part of Ukrainian territory until they declared independence. Then they became an independent entity. And without the approval of parliament, the Duma, Russian troops can't be deployed on these territories legally. So what Wagner did is provided a vehicle for Russia to surge military capability into Lugansk to support the Lugansk People's Republic military formations, and also Donetsk. So Wagner was a private military company that operated with the full permission of the Russian government. I mean, and they received a lot of money and a lot of resources, and they were very effective. And in September of 2022, though, when Donetsk and Lugansk, through the referendum, became part of Russian territory, Wagner was told, you're going to have to convert to the Russian military legally. You can't continue to exist. We will honor what the Russian government said. We will honor the one-year contract, because in May of 2022, they signed a one-year contract with Wagner that expired in May of 2023. We'll honor this contract, but by the time May 2023 comes, your soldiers either have to go home or sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense. And Prigozhin decided that he was going to make some money. He said, no, I got a money-making machine here. I don't want to give this up. And so he started this legend of Wagner supremacy. He started, criticizing Shoigu and Gerasimov and the Russian military and the Russian way of fighting.
It's crazy times.
Understand that Prigozhin fought in Lugansk, but the Russian military fought everywhere else and was doing quite well. The Akhmat Special Forces came to Lugansk, and they partnered with Wagner, fought side by side with them. I know Abdi Aladinov very well. He's the commander of the Akhmat Special Forces, and he has spoken, in high regard of Wagner and initially of Prigozhin. But he said at one point in time, he said it's very important to understand this, that the needs of Russia come before everything. And Prigozhin forgot that. Prigozhin put the needs of Prigozhin ahead of Russia, and that didn't go over well. They fought a very effective war. There's the twin cities of Soledar and Bakhmut. They both had very extensive fortifications, underground tunnels, etc. And Wagner launched a successful battle for Soledar and took it. And at that point in time, Wagner was told, stand down. Now we're going to freeze the line, consolidate, and then we're going to do a rotation. We're going to bring in the 76th Airborne Division and rotate out because your troops have to come back and either sign contracts or go away. What Prigozhin did on his own volition is continued the assault into Bakhmut without any permission. He went into Bakhmut and he got involved in the Bakhmut meat grinder. Now, one of the things he was able to do with this is he was able to go to prisons and recruit prisoners and have them sign 6-month contracts. And basically, these prisoners, if they came in, survived the 6 months, would get a pass of good conduct from the Russian government saying all is forgiven, you go back to society, you're out of prison. But they weren't very well trained. They're not like the original Wagner troops, who were all veterans, special forces veterans, very skilled combatants. These became the expendables. And Prigozhin built entire units of these prisoners, sent them in frontal attacks, meat grinder operations to keep the battle going, because that's what he needed. He needed to keep the battle going. And then he began to say, look at all the men I'm losing. Well, you lost them because you took untrained prisoners and threw them into an urban conflict where the Ukrainians slaughtered. Now, they were killing the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians lost 60,000 men in Bakhmut. It was a two-way street. Zelensky burned up his reserves. They were supposed to go in the Ropatino battle in December 23, got burned up in Bakhmut. But Prigozhin bled Wagner to death in Bakhmut and forced the Russians now, because when you advance into Bakhmut, that means the Russians now have to defend your flanks. And the flanks being defended wasn't something Russians prepared for. Ammunition allocation is important, is critical. You allocate the ammunition where you need it. And because they had said they're going to pause on this part of the battlefield, they went into standard defensive allocations of artillery ammunition. Now Prigozhin's launching a major offensive operation, and he's demanding to have offensive allocations when the Russian military went, we don't have any artillery for you. And he said, look, Shoigu and Gerasimov are slaughtering me. There's not enough. These guys are incompetent. It was all a manufactured case by Prigozhin. Shoigu and Gerasimov are not incompetent. The Russians were doing quite well, but Prigozhin forced that issue. And finally, when the Battle of Bakhmut ended in the middle of May, he was ordered to stand down and ordered to disarm his troops. And that's when he said, I'm not going to do that. He believed his own propaganda, and he got 1/3 of the Wagner forces, many of whom had no idea what they were doing, but got them on the road moving to Moscow. And Abdi Aladonov's Akhmat Special Forces closed in on Rostov. And people keep saying it was Lukashenko intervening and telling, with a phone call. It was Abdi's forces outside saying, in a couple hours, we're going to be ordered to go in and we're going to kill Prigozhin, we're going to kill Wagner, and we're going to end this thing now. And that's when Prigozhin woke up and went, I'm done.
So I was before ending it, just came in now. Putin just made comments on the sanctions. So the US sanctioned the two largest Russian oil companies, and we also got reports, and that comes about a few weeks after India apparently agreed with the US to halt 50% of their oil imports from Russia. And there's also been reports, I showed it to you before we started this interview, Reuters exclusive, China state oil majors suspend Russian oil buys due to sanctions, according to sources. which you've got doubts about, which I'll let you talk about. But then Putin just put out a statement now. New U.S. sanctions are an attempt to put pressure on Russia. No self-respecting country ever does anything under pressure. This will cost the EU dearly. The cancelled Budapest summit was proposed by the American side, not the Russian side. Dialogue is always better than confrontation, disputes, or continuing the war. The new U.S. sanctions are a hostile act that does not strengthen Russian-American relations. That came in from Putin. What are your thoughts on the sanctions and also Putin's response just now?
I mean, it's an accurate response. The Russians, they want this war to end so that they can bring stability in the region, and then they want to have better relations with the United States. They believe that, the U.S. and Russia can do things together that improve both nations, but it can't happen with this Ukraine conflict, going on down here. I think Putin's disappointed. But the other thing people have to understand is India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India is part of the BRICS. Modi has visited Putin. And Xi Jinping and Putin have a famously good relationship. They're also SCO and BRICS members. They all recognize that America is a unilateral hegemony that seeks to impose itself on people through threats of military threats, economic threats, etc.